Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. When we think of George Washington and colonial Virginia, we don't usually think about murder and crime. But there's evil under the sun, even in colonial Virginia. Then as now, people will be people. Our guest today is my co-host, Andrew Mills, who, among his many other talents, is a mystery writer, and he writes about colonial crime and mystery. So, welcome as a writer.
Yeah, a little different on this side of the stage.
So, give us a little bit about how you became a writer. What's the background for your writing persona?
Well, when it came to writing, it really just kind of happened completely by happenstance. This isn't something where you used to sit down and say, you know what, I want to be a writer. Instead, it was just a question of having an overactive imagination, trying to come up with different ideas, and putting together these stories. And as I was coming up with these stories, the thought was introduced to me, well, why not write a colonial detective mystery? You've got lots of different genres of mysteries out there. You have modern mysteries, which there's plenty of. You have Poirot, which is England, 1930s. You've got The Thin Man, which again, 1930s, but San Francisco. You have Sherlock Holmes, the penultimate. And you even have detectives from ancient Rome, of all places, before even the word detective comes around. And so, you don't really hear a lot about these things from the colonial era. And certainly there's a lot of different mysteries and things that happen which kind of make you scratch your head a little bit and go, I wonder how you could explain this away. And it just proved to be something that kind of took on a whole life of its own.
So where do you get your ideas from? I mean, do you just make these things up? Are they true historical crimes?
You try to go for something that's true. You don't want to, because trying to create a fantastic story, like for instance, you mentioned George Washington. Okay, well, so George Washington went out one day and shot a man. Okay, let's figure out all the things that are wrong with this story. George Washington isn't going out there just to shoot somebody for the sake of, I'm going to shoot you. There is a historical event of where he found himself on the receiving end of a duel challenge, and he would put out a very public apology for an insult he gave a person in order to prevent this duel from going forward. Now that happened, but that doesn't really create a very interesting story. I mean, there's enough drama, but it's not enough to write a full story on. But then you start looking at events that are real in history, that come from newspapers, come from local legends about, well, this person was murdered, but they never found the killer, and they came up with this brilliant scheme to catch him. And that's a great mystery, so why did the person get killed? How ridiculous does this sound? Maybe somebody else can try to solve the crime while the ridiculousness of the other idea comes into play. And then you have the local legends and mysteries and things that pop up, and when these occur, you look at the basic story, and when you boil down all of the nonsense that's there, you have this root mystery, and you're saying, well, how can you solve it? Maybe time dissolve the answer, so let's create an answer.
Now, I know you've written a lot of short stories around a character you called Archibald Mercer, who was a colonial detective in Alexandria, Virginia. So can you give us an example of where you got an idea, and then what was your creative process? Did you just bang out 50,000 words and then just start cutting, or did you just kind of lay and stare at the ceiling? How does it work?
Well, 2 a.m. in the morning is a very forgiving editor because you don't have to worry about people bothering you or real life taking over. But the first Archibald Mercer story is actually The Female Stranger. And The Female Stranger is based off of a real legend that comes out of the city of Alexandria. And history records that in the year 1816, a ship will arrive, 2 people get off of it, they go to Gadsby's Tavern, they get holed up into a room, and they stay there for a little over a month, and the wife dies. And the husband will bury her, and he gets a tombstone, which is a tabletop tombstone, and on it he has engraved The Female Stranger. And so, I mean, in and of itself, the story is just an unbelievable mystery. But what adds more fire to the mystery is the fact that the husband just skips town, never pays the bill. And so people want to know who it is. There's only a handful of folks in town that know this couple's identity, and no one says a word. So curiosity grows. And there are really three base rumors behind the identity of this woman. The first one, and the most logical of them all, is that this is two people who are part of a lover's triangle that are on the run from the third person. And that's the most logical story. The next one, which based off the time period is somewhat logical, but we start pushing off into the fantastic a little bit, is their French nobility or somehow related to Napoleon. The third one, which is the most fantastic of them all and the most outlandish, is that the female stranger was Theodosia Burr Alston, who is the daughter of Aaron Burr and the widow to the former governor of South Carolina. Now, in her circumstance, though, what kind of pokes the big hole in this story is that she purportedly dies while sailing to New York to meet her father when he's returning from his self-imposed exile to Europe. And so all of a sudden her life takes on mysteries of, well, supposedly she was kidnapped by pirates. Supposedly the pirates killed her. Supposedly she was in a sea storm, washed up onto the shore of all places, Galveston, Texas, and marries into an Indian tribe. Now that
So she's like the Amelia Earhart of that period.
But the only problem with that third one is that, I mean, Galveston, Texas versus Cape Hatteras are in two completely different directions, and you have a big giant landmass called Florida in your way. So it's a little hard to believe that she could have floated that far. But the first two, the pirates, you know, they kidnapped her, then you start bringing in the Galveston story, or they killed her, which is entirely possible as well. We just don't know. And so you have a bunch of things that go into play. And so the female stranger, you start putting together pieces of the story that have been somewhat accepted as local legend, but then you start to weave, well, what if some of those local legends have truth to it? And then we just start to really magnify the true aspect, and we're getting into the nitty-gritty. Mm-hmm. And by doing this, you create a whole story.
But now, there are wonderful stories all in the colonial period that kind of lend themselves, like the story of the Jersey Devil, for example.
Mm-hmm. The Jersey Devil is a unique story in that, according to legend in New Jersey, there was a woman whose husband, they seemingly understood the old adage of Mr. Spock of live long and prosper, especially the prosper part, as she had already had 12 children. And so when she found out she was pregnant again, she had prayed that this child be a demon. And so when she gave birth to the child, out comes this bouncing little baby boy. She holds the baby, and no sooner does she hold the child than it grows out a tail, its legs turn into hooves, it sprouts wings, and mutates into this monster and flies away. Now, the funny thing is that the Jersey Devil story doesn't really come into play until the American Revolution. And that's when it really takes a lot more substance. And historians argue that the Jersey Devil may actually be a tool that was used to prevent British or Hessian troops from going deeper into New Jersey to start threatening towards Philadelphia if they were concerned that you have to go through this forest that, oh, by the way, the spawn of the devil lives. And because, you know, you have a lot of these very much uneducated individuals in an army, they're more likely and prone to believe that there may be a real monster lurking in the woods.
Of psychological warfare.
It's psychological warfare, but I mean, at the same time, just consider how we live our lives today. I mean, you have, you know, if something happens to you in your childhood, and you all of a sudden have an irrational fear of that fill-in-the-blank object, and you know, you can have years and years and years of a perfectly normal life, but there's that irrational fear that just, you know, despite everything you know, prevents you from doing something.
Well, your new book, The Washington Heir, mm-hmm. you don't see too many novels about George Washington, and you certainly don't see very many mysteries about George Washington. So Can you give us a little background on, why you chose this?
Well, the Washington era has a lot of different unique stories attached to it, and one of the things that ends up happening with George Washington is we do know so much about his life, but then there are areas of it we just don't know the first thing about. But when you start listening to like events, you start hearing stories from other people that talking. For instance, one story that I had heard is that, oh, well, at one time someone opened up the tomb of George Washington and they looked inside and saw his body, and the person said, yeah, and he looked like he was alive. He must be a vampire or something. Well, this particular story, when I heard this, was popular at the time, where there's this 19th century picture of a gentleman that looks eerily a lot like Nicolas Cage. And they're saying, well, Nicolas Cage must be a vampire. He lives forever. Okay, so all of a sudden you start looking into this. Well, did anyone ever look in George Washington's grave? And the answer is yes, that did happen.
Well, why did they look in George Washington's grave?
Well, it kind of backtracks into this whole idea of venue. So why did they look in there? Well, they looked into his coffin because they were moving him into this marble sarcophagus, which still exists today at Mount Vernon. Okay, well, why did they have to move him to begin with? And you just keep asking these whys, and as you're going further and further back on the whys, you're discovering more to the story than meets the eye. And the real origin of the story...
So really, this is a real-life mystery that you turned into a fictional mystery.
Well, right. It's a real-life mystery that I kind of walk backwards into, and in the process of walking backwards into it, all of a sudden, it creates a rather unique aspect to it. And so what happened is that, and I've read two different versions of the story. They both basically have the same principle, but the start year is different in each one. One says it's in 1829, the other one says it's 1830, but the basic gist is the same. A gardener at Mount Vernon is fired from his job, disgruntled by it. In the middle of the night, he returns to Mount Vernon, breaks into the tomb of George Washington, and purportedly steals some bones, a skull and some bones specifically, that he claims belonged to George Washington. Now, in talking with the folks at Mount Vernon, they said, well, the missing bones were recovered rather quickly, and that's the end of the story. Well, what happened to the gardener? We don't know. Why not? Maybe the family was embarrassed by the robbery. Maybe they didn't want the publicity. Or, says the writer in me, maybe there's more to the story than meets the eye. Next thing you know, the new tomb is built. Washington's bodies get moved. A couple years later, they build a wall around the tomb. A couple years after that, you have this marble sarcophagus. And then the vestibule has a roof on it. But this is what makes it so interesting. Because if you read information about the tomb of George Washington, a gentleman by the name of Strickland, who is the architect, wrote in 1840, I put a metal roof over the vestibule because apparently there had been a break-in a few years earlier. So
there's a lot of actual strange events surrounding the tomb, even without fictionalizing it. Now, your book, without giving anything away, alternates between current-day Virginia and George Washington's Virginia, which I think is a very interesting approach. So you do learn a lot about colonial times, but it's something we can all identify with.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's an interesting approach because part of it is that if you just write the story straight out colonial era, it's all fine and good. But it's like, all right, but then it comes back to that question, well, why did the gardener break in? He's disgruntled. Well, if you're going to be disgruntled, I mean, breaking into the tomb of George Washington is pretty big disgruntled. I mean, we know Lincoln's tomb got broke into, but the guy who did it thought this would be a great way to ransom the body, make money, and things like that. I mean, there's a reason. We can understand that. But this one doesn't have a reason. And so it begs the question, well, what was the reason? And so in trying to figure it out, one of the things that you also discover is that before George Washington died, he had two wills. When he was dying in his bed, he asked for his wills to be brought to him. He read one, said, this is it, had the other one burned. Well, what's in the other one? The theory is they were probably identical, just one had some slight variance as compared to the other. But then it occurred to me, okay, so you have two wills, one gets burned. 30 years later, give or take, someone breaks into the tomb. Well, what if the two somehow were connected? Well, this creates an interesting little mystery. Now we're starting to build a plot. You've got someone who knew something was in Washington's will meant for them, and now they're breaking into his tomb in order to collect. Now we're starting to build this mystery. But, you know, how in the world do you ever connect those dots with the present day? And this is where, you know, thanks to 24/7 news cycles and the fact that anything on social media can create an instant story, we have our excuse. I mean, people come out and claim, oh, well, I'm the illegitimate child of X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And so it's like we had the famous case of Sally Hemings, where it was proven there's Jefferson DNA. But with DNA testing, there's no way to prove conclusively that Thomas Jefferson was the father. But there's enough circumstantial evidence to say that he was. Mm-hmm. And this is where it starts to come into play.
Well, a number of conspiracy theories revolving around Martha Washington burning all of the general's letters after his death. I mean, you have to wonder what was in those letters. I mean,
well, burning personal correspondence was a very common practice in the 18th century. So, you know, a lot of people say, "Ooh, there must have been something steamy in there." No, it was just their personal correspondence, and it was their life. And her logic is, it's our life, and it's not yours, so leave us alone. Now, historians beg to differ and say, no, your life is our life because we're studying you. But at the same time, it's very common. I mean, you don't have a John Adams and Abigail Adams come around every day say, we're going to keep a copy of our letters so we know what's going on.
Okay.
You don't have a Thomas Jefferson who says, I'm going to make a machine to hook up to my arm so I can just go ahead and write 2 copies of my letters at all times. I mean, most people are just tossing. I mean, how many letters do you still have that you have written from the past?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so people in that era valued their privacy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's something that we could try to bring back today. And
now, you know, you were talking about these stories about pretended heirs popping up. And I know there was a individual named Thomas Posey, who was a real historical person.
Well, Thomas Posey is an interesting case because there's a famous story at Mount Vernon of where they say Washington wrote in his journal, Posey finally left after apparently being there for an extremely extended period of time. Only problem is that this is an urban legend story that has virtually no basis in reality. Yet the name Posey itself does have some truth to it. Washington had this neighbor by the name of Thomas Posey who had a family, but Thomas Posey was not a very good businessman. In fact, he actually lost more money than you could ever hope to make in a lifetime. And supposedly the Washingtons took the Posey children in and had them stay with them at Mount Vernon for a while. And the eldest son, also named Thomas, would leave to head out west to strike his fortune. Now, a lot of people say, and this is where this urban legend of Thomas Posey comes into play, that he may have been the illegitimate child of George Washington because they claim that he had a respectable parentage and lineage, and people claim, oh, well, he looks just like George Washington. Well, the problem is that if you pull up a portrait of Thomas Posey, lo and behold, yes, he does look like Washington, but so does everybody else, because not every artist was necessarily a very good artist. You had what was called a drapery artist. And a drapery artist is the artist who can actually draw everything from the neck down with perfect detail, but from the neck up, nothing. And so they create these generic faces, or faces that they can do. There was one drapery artist who made every woman look like a sister because he knew how to draw a sister. So we have these fantastic portraits of a woman's figure up to the head, and the head just doesn't seem to match the body.
I see.
And so, portrait. So I mean, you take portrait, okay, throw that out. You look at the timelines that historians claim to bring about Thomas Posey and George Washington; they just don't link up. They're off by, in some cases, 4 years. But part of the reason why this legend persists so much is because Thomas Posey lives the kind of life that a child of Washington should live. He becomes a war hero. He's instrumental in westward movement. He becomes part of the new government. In fact, he's the first governor of Indiana. And so when you start putting in all of these things, all of a sudden it's like, you know what, this guy could have been a George Washington. The only problem is he doesn't have the name.
Wow. So it's kind of wishful thinking.
It's a lot of wishful thinking, I think, and part of it is just, you're basically, there's a great analogy of 2 + 2 = chair. Oh, you're right, because you're putting together the circumstantial evidence and saying, well, I think this is right, even though it's wrong.
Now, people who are interested in genealogy are going to be fascinated by this book because you talk about a lot of the problems with genealogical research and the pitfalls.
Yes. Genealogy is a fascinating field. There's a lot to it. In fact, anyone that hasn't ever tried doing their genealogy really should, because you'd be amazed at the things you discover about your family. And in going back, one of the problems you're going to have is you start going through your family tree and you have to ask your family, well, when was the earliest time somebody in the family got to America? And the reason this is so important is because in 1921, a fire broke out in the census building. And when this fire broke out, it destroyed the entire 1890 census. And only a couple of states had copies of theirs. And so those are the only states where we have records. And so because this fire destroyed the vast majority of the 1890 census, now you have a new problem on your hands, because you have 1880, got my family member. 1900, you better hope that family member hasn't died, or somebody that has the same name is introduced into the storyline. Because no 1890 census for the majority of the country, now you're jumping a very big leap. And this is usually a problem, because a lot of folks can get back to 1900 and then they don't find their relative there. Maybe they showed up in the 1890s. Maybe they showed up in the 1880s, would have been counted in the 1890 census, but since it went up in flames, they're no longer there.
So there's this 20-year void, and a lot of people just kind of disappear. The link is broken, which I guess leads people to make assumptions which may or may not be correct.
And that's true. I mean, this is one of those big, very difficult things, is that because you've lost so much ground, you need to find ways to piece it together. And so this is really where understanding the family traditions and family trees, and you're able to put these things together, it helps.
Yeah. And it's kind of getting those odd bits of information, which can really be like the key to unraveling it. Just, the smallest bit of anecdotal information that you get from a relative.
And that's really part of it, and that's the clue, because you see, one of the other problems that comes up with genealogy is spelling. People don't always spell their names the same over time. There's a famous story of a Jewish man who shows up, and he gives his name, and the clerk at Ellis Island couldn't write down the name. She said, you know what, your name's Smith. And so all of a sudden, you have these very Jewish first names, Smith. Mm-hmm. I mean, to take a name, I mean, let's say you have Shlomo Smith.
Right.
I mean, how in the world do you have an Irish last name with a Jewish first name?
Right.
And the reason is because Ellis Island changed their name.
Right. Interesting. Well, you have other stories in the cooker.
Yes.
Some of them have to do with colonial times, and some of them have to do with modern times. Maybe you can share what's next.
Well, we do have a new exciting one that should be coming out very soon, called The Stolen Sash, which revolves around a rather interesting chapter again in George Washington's life, of where he is given where General Braddock, as he lays dying, gives Washington his sash. Something that I have actually seen as a fascinating piece in and of itself. And so you kind
Where is that?
That's actually in the Preservation Department at Mount Vernon, and that will go ahead and come in and out of their museum on a rotating basis. And so, but it's a fascinating piece to look at because you ask yourself, how does he come into possession of this? We have another story in the works, an art mystery about portraits getting stolen, which folks always seem to enjoy. The remake of the Thomas Crown Affair was all about painting, art theft. So,
Well, we look forward to reading many, many more Archibald Mercer and some of the other new characters that you're bringing along. To learn more about the Washingtonaire, the Female Stranger, and the many other stories in the Archibald Mercer Colonial Detective Series, visit our website at www.timetravel21.com. And if you'd like to communicate with the author, write to us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. We want to thank you for tuning in to Virginia Time Travel, your portal of the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.